Truth and deception dance a dangerous waltz when hearts are on the line. In the rugged Montana territory of 1885, one woman's desperate search for a new beginning would lead her straight into the arms of a man whose very name struck fear across the western frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her journey from innocent bride to woman of strength would challenge everything she believed about love, loyalty, and the power of redemption. The stagecoach rattled violently as it navigated the last stretch of road into Silver Creek. Margaret Wilson clutched her worn leather satchel tightly against her chest, her knuckles white with tension. 26 years of life in Philadelphia hadn't prepared her for the bone-jarring journey across the frontier, but desperation had a way of making the impossible seem necessary. 3 weeks earlier, she had been Margaret Wilson, spinster schoolteacher with mounting debts and no prospects, following her father's death. Now she was Margaret Wilson, mail-order bride to a man she'd never met, a cattle rancher named Thomas Sullivan, who had advertised for a practical woman of good character and education to share in the building of a prosperous future in Montana territory. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside Silver Creek's only hotel, a 2-story wooden structure that had seen better days. Margaret smoothed her travel-wrinkled dress and adjusted her hat, determined to make a respectable first impression despite the exhaustion that seeped into her very bones. "Silver Creek," the driver called, already unloading bags from the roof. "End of the line." Margaret stepped carefully onto the dusty street, blinking in the harsh afternoon sunlight. Silver Creek was nothing like she had imagined. A single, muddy street lined with weathered buildings, a saloon prominently positioned among them. No sign of the growing township with promise Thomas had described in his letters. "Miss Wilson?" She turned to find a tall man approaching, his face partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He moved with a certain wariness, eyes scanning the street before settling on her. Not the confident stride of a successful rancher, but something more, cautious. "Mr. Sullivan?" she asked, trying to match his face to the vague description she had built in her mind from his letters. He nodded once, removing his hat to reveal dark hair and eyes that couldn't quite meet hers. "Welcome to Silver Creek. How was your journey?" "Long," Margaret admitted, studying him carefully. Thomas Sullivan was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, with a handsome face weathered by sun and wind. His clothes were of good quality, but worn at the edges. Most striking were his hands, not the calloused hands of a cattleman, but leaner, with long fingers that spoke of more delicate work. "The ranch is about an hour's ride from town," he said, taking her bag. "I thought you might want to rest before heading out. I've arranged a room for you here." The consideration surprised her. In truth, she had expected to be whisked off to be married immediately upon arrival. Their arrangement had been clear. She would come west, they would marry, and she would help manage his household and teach the children of nearby homesteaders for additional income. "That's very thoughtful, Mr. Sullivan, but I'm quite prepared to continue on if you prefer." Something flickered across his face. Relief? Concern? "Best to rest. We'll leave at first light." He glanced down the street, that same watchfulness returning. "I have some business to attend to in town. I'll return for supper if that's agreeable." Margaret nodded, sensing there was more beneath his clipped sentences than mere social awkwardness. Back east, she had prided herself on reading people, a necessary skill for a schoolteacher. Thomas Sullivan was a man carrying secrets. She was certain of it. The hotel room was clean but sparse, offering little more than a narrow bed, washstand, and a small window overlooking the main street. Margaret unpacked her few belongings, carefully hanging her wedding dress, a simple blue affair that had belonged to her mother. She splashed water on her face, trying to wash away the dust of travel. and the nagging doubt that had followed her across the country. What did she really know about Thomas Sullivan? His letters had been articulate, specific about his expectations, but vague about his past. He had sent money for her passage, a considerable sum that suggested his cattle business was indeed prosperous. Yet something about their brief interaction left her uneasy. From her window, Margaret observed the town coming to life as evening approached. Miners and cowboys drifted toward the saloon. A woman in a vibrant dress too fine for a frontier town hurried down the boardwalk. And there, emerging from the sheriff's office, was Thomas Sullivan, his conversation with the lawman appearing intense even from a distance. When he glanced up at her window, Margaret stepped back instinctively, a flush of embarrassment warming her cheeks at being caught observing him. But something in his expression, a fleeting vulnerability quickly masked, stirred her curiosity even further. Supper was a quiet affair in the hotel's small dining room. Thomas spoke politely about the ranch, the challenges of the recent dry season, his plans for expanding his herd. He asked appropriate questions about her journey and her teaching experience. Yet Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was participating in a carefully rehearsed performance. "Mr. Sullivan," she said finally, setting down her fork, "I believe in directness. If we are to be married, there should be honesty between us." His posture stiffened slightly. "Of course. You seem concerned about something. Is there a difficulty regarding our arrangement that I should know about?" Thomas studied her for a long moment, as if weighing decisions behind those guarded eyes. "No difficulty, Miss Wilson, only the usual concerns of a rancher. Cattle prices are falling, and there's been trouble with rustlers in the territory." It was a reasonable explanation, yet Margaret wasn't convinced. 7 years of teaching had honed her ability to detect half-truths from reluctant students. "And your business with the sheriff today, was that regarding these rustlers?" Surprise registered briefly on his face. "You're observant." "Yes, Sheriff Morgan keeps ranchers informed about suspicious activities in the area." The conversation shifted to safer topics, her plans for teaching, the neighboring families whose children would need education. By the time they parted for the evening, Margaret had regained some confidence in her decision. Despite his reticence, Thomas Sullivan seemed honorable and intelligent. Perhaps his guardedness was simply the natural result of a solitary life on the frontier. Morning arrived, with a pale light filtering through the threadbare curtains. Margaret dressed carefully in her most practical traveling outfit, steeling herself for the next step in her journey. A wedding, a new home, a life with a man who remained largely a mystery. Thomas was waiting with a wagon when she descended the hotel steps, her small trunk and satchel containing everything she had brought to her new life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He helped her up to the seat with courteous efficiency, his touch light and impersonal. The journey to the Sullivan Ranch passed largely in silence. Margaret watched the landscape transform from the dusty streets of Silver Creek to rolling grasslands, dotted with sagebrush and distant pine-covered hills. It was beautiful in its vastness, so different from the crowded confines of Philadelphia. "There," Thomas said finally, nodding toward the horizon. "Sullivan Ranch." Margaret followed his gaze, expecting a modest homestead. Instead, she saw an impressive spread nestled in a valley between protective ridges. A large main house built of solid timber, a barn, corral, and several outbuildings. Cattle grazed on the surrounding hillsides, and a stream glinted in the morning sun. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. "You didn't mention in your letters that your operation was so substantial." Thomas's hands tightened on the reins. "Been building it up for 5 years now. Started with nothing but that one-room cabin there." He nodded toward a small structure near the stream. As they approached, A man emerged from the barn, tall and broad-shouldered with a shock of red hair. "That's Michael," Thomas explained. "My foreman. Only full-time help I keep on. Rest are seasonal hands." Michael watched their approach with open curiosity. Margaret noted the respect in his nod to Thomas, but also something else, a wordless communication that passed between the men. "Welcome to Sullivan Ranch, Miss Wilson," Michael said, helping her down from the wagon. "Hope the boss didn't talk your ear off on the ride out. Man's known to go on once he gets started." The gentle teasing contrasted so sharply with Thomas's reserved demeanor that Margaret couldn't help but smile. Mr. Sullivan has been a perfect gentleman, if somewhat economical with conversation. A fleeting smile crossed Thomas's face, the first she'd seen, transforming his features momentarily into something warmer, more approachable. Michael exaggerates. "Miss Wilson needs to settle in. We'll want to head to town for the ceremony. Tomorrow, weather permitting." The main house surprised Margaret once again. The exterior's rugged simplicity gave way to unexpectedly refined interiors. The furniture was solid and well-crafted, the kitchen equipped with modern conveniences. She hadn't anticipated finding so far from civilization. Most surprising was the small library adjacent to the main living area, its shelves filled with volumes of history, literature, and science. "You're a reader," she observed, running her fingers along leather-bound spines. "Winter nights are long." "In Montana," Thomas replied, watching her explore the space that would soon be her home. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the right. I thought you might want to rest before supper." "Thank you. This is all quite impressive, Mr. Sullivan. Your letters didn't do justice to what you've built here." Something flashed in his eyes. Pride mingled with what looked like guilt. "I'll leave you to get settled, then." He turned to go, then paused. "Miss Wilson, Margaret, I want you to know that I intend to be a good husband. You'll want for nothing here." The simple declaration, delivered with such evident sincerity, eased some of Margaret's lingering apprehension. "I believe you, Mr. Sullivan, and I intend to fulfill my part of our arrangement as well." Alone in her room, a pleasant space with a patchwork quilt on the bed and curtains that matched the upholstery below, Margaret began unpacking her belongings. The normalcy of the task calmed her racing thoughts. Whatever secrets Thomas Sullivan might harbor, he had been honest about his circumstances and appeared genuinely committed to their arrangement. As she placed her mother's Bible on the bedside table, a floorboard creaked beneath the rug. Curious, Margaret knelt to investigate and found the board loose. Lifting it revealed a small space beneath, and within it, a folded newspaper clipping and a worn leather pouch. Margaret hesitated, her conscience warring with curiosity. This was not her home yet, not her property to explore. And yet... The newspaper headline stopped her breath. $5,000 reward for infamous Collins gang leader. Below, it was a rough sketch of a man's face, a face she recognized instantly despite the artist's imprecise rendering. Thomas Sullivan. Except the article called him Thomas Collins, leader of the Collins gang, wanted for a series of daring bank robberies across Colorado and Wyoming territories. Margaret's hands trembled as she unfolded the leather pouch, revealing a stack of folded bills and a tarnished silver pocket watch engraved with the initials TC. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her as implications cascaded through her mind. She had agreed to marry an outlaw, a bank robber with a price on his head, a man living under a false identity. Her carefully planned future crumbled like sand through her fingers. A soft knock at the door made her heart leap to her throat. Hastily, she returned the items to their hiding place and smoothed the rug. "Miss Wilson," Thomas's voice came through the door. "Supper will be ready shortly." "Thank you. I'll be down momentarily." She was astonished by the steadiness of her own voice when her entire world had just shifted on its axis. What should she do? Confront him? Flee back to Silver Creek? The options raced through her mind as she straightened her appearance in the small mirror, hardly recognizing the wide-eyed woman who stared back. Supper was a surreal experience. Thomas and Michael discussed cattle prices and plans for moving the herd to new pastures. While Margaret picked at her food, every glance at her soon-to-be husband now colored by her discovery. No longer did she see a reserved rancher, but a criminal skilled enough to build a new identity and prosperous enough to do it with the proceeds of his crimes. "Miss Wilson, are you feeling unwell?" Thomas asked, concern evident in his expression. The journey must have been exhausting. "I'm quite all right," she managed. "Just adjusting to the altitude, I expect." Michael excused himself after the meal, leaving Margaret alone with Thomas. In the kitchen, she helped clear the dishes, her mind racing for a plan, a way forward that wouldn't end in disaster. "You've gone quiet," Thomas observed, drying a plate with methodical care. "Having second thoughts?" The direct question startled her. "Should I be Mr. Sullivan?" His eyes met hers fully for the first time since her arrival, dark and unreadable. Most sensible people reconsider major life decisions when there's still time to change course. Was it a warning, an offer of escape? Margaret set down the dish towel, gathering her courage. "Mr. Sullivan—" The sudden pounding on the front door cut her off. Thomas's posture changed instantly, tension radiating through his frame as he moved to the window and peered cautiously through the curtain. "Stay here," he instructed, his voice dropping to a whisper. He moved to a cabinet, extracting a revolver that he checked with practiced efficiency. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest as she watched him disappear into the front room. The murmur of men's voices followed, too low to distinguish words but urgent in tone. When Thomas returned, his face had hardened into something she hadn't seen before, the face of a man accustomed to danger and quick decisions. "I need to go out for a while," he said, already reaching for his coat. "Lock the doors behind me. Michael will be in the bunkhouse if you need anything." "What's happening?" Margaret asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Thomas paused, conflict evident in his expression. "Nothing for you to worry about. Just some trouble with a neighboring ranch. I'll explain when I return." Another lie, Margaret thought. And yet, the concern in his eyes when he looked at her seemed genuine. "Be careful," she said, surprising herself with the sentiment. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Always am." After he left, Margaret moved through the quiet house, locking doors as instructed, her mind churning with possibilities. She returned to her room and the hidden newspaper clipping, rereading it carefully. The Collins gang had been notorious 3 years earlier, responsible for at least 7 bank robberies. They were known for their meticulous planning and for never firing a shot during their heists, a point the article emphasized as unusual. The gang had disappeared after a job in Cheyenne, with rumors placing them in Canada or California. Or, it seemed, hiding in plain sight in Montana territory. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, the full weight of her situation settling over her. She had fled Philadelphia to escape scandal and debt after her father's gambling habits left her nearly destitute. The position of a respectable rancher's wife had offered salvation, financial security, and a fresh start, far from whispers and creditors. Now she faced an impossible choice: marry a wanted outlaw or return east in disgrace, her situation even more desperate than before. A sudden commotion outside drew her to the window. In the moonlight, she could make out Thomas and Michael leading horses from the barn, their movements urgent. 3 other men waited mounted, their faces indistinct in the darkness. Without thinking about consequences, Margaret grabbed her shawl and slipped downstairs and out the back door. The night air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and sounds carried clearly across the yard. She edged closer to the barn, staying in the shadows. "Not a coincidence, Tom," one of the riders was saying. Pinkerton agents in Silver Creek asking questions at the same time Wells shows up looking for you. Could be after the Farley brothers, Thomas replied, tightening a saddle strap. They've been operating near Bozeman. It's not the Farleys. They described, Michael cut in. It was you, clear as day. Said they had a witness from the Cheyenne job ready to testify. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle her gasp. Pinkerton agents, famous for tracking outlaws across state. Lines, relentless in their pursuit. How much time do we have? Thomas asked. They're organizing a search party for first light. Sheriff Morgan sent word. Says he can stall them till noon. But after that... Thomas nodded grimly. Get the men ready. We'll move the emergency. Funds and supplies tonight. Follow the plan we established. And the woman, Michael asked, his voice lowering, your bride-to-be? A long silence followed, heavy with unspoken complications. I'll handle it, Thomas said finally. She doesn't deserve to be caught in this. Margaret retreated silently to the house, her mind racing faster than her heartbeat. They were planning to flee. Tonight. The life she had traveled so far to build would evaporate like morning dew under a harsh sun. Back in her room, she paced the floor, weighing her options with desperate clarity. She could pretend ignorance, wake tomorrow to find Thomas gone, and lay the abandoned bride for the Pinkerton agents. She could attempt to reach Silver Creek tonight, on foot, an impossible journey in darkness through unfamiliar territory, or... The third option crystallized slowly, madness wrapped in a veneer of practicality. She could confront Thomas Sullivan, or Collins, directly, negotiate her own future rather than accepting whatever fate the men downstairs were planning for her. Decision made, Margaret changed from her house dress into her traveling outfit, secured what few valuables she possessed in her pockets, and made her way downstairs to wait. It was nearly midnight when Thomas returned to the house, moving quietly as if to avoid waking her. His surprise at finding her, seated calmly in the library, lamp lit beside her, was evident in the momentary freeze of his movements. "You should be asleep," he said, removing his hat. "As should you, if we're to travel to town tomorrow for our wedding." Margaret kept her voice steady, watching his reaction carefully. Thomas set his hat on the table, his expression guarded. "About that. There's been a change of circumstances. I'm afraid we'll need to postpone." "Because of the Pinkerton agents in Silver Creek," Margaret interrupted, rising to her feet. "Or because they're asking questions about Thomas Collins and the Cheyenne bank robbery." The color drained from his face, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun at his hip before stopping. "How long have you known?" "Since this afternoon. I found the newspaper clipping in my room." She held his gaze steadily. "Were you ever going to tell me, or was I just a convenient cover for your new identity?" For a moment, he looked like a man trying to decide whether to run or fight. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of secrets evidently heavy upon them. "It wasn't like that," he said quietly. "I needed a wife, yes, respectability, someone above suspicion. But everything else I told you was true. The ranch, the teaching position, my intentions to provide for you well." "Paid for with stolen money," Margaret pointed out. "Yes." He didn't attempt to deny it. "Though no one was ever hurt during our jobs, we had rules, strict ones." "Noble thieves?" She couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "Hardly noble." A bitter smile crossed his face. "Just less monstrous than some. I was done with that life, Margaret. Have been for 3 years. Built something legitimate here." Margaret studied the man before her, the outlaw she had agreed to marry, searching for deceit in his expression and finding instead a complicated truth. "And now you're running again, tonight." He nodded, watching her carefully. "I've made arrangements for you. There's money in my desk, enough to get you back east or wherever you choose to go. A letter explaining that I was called away on urgent business, should anyone ask. "How considerate," Margaret said, surprised by the edge in her own voice. "And what happens to you?" "I have contingencies, places to go, ways to disappear." "Alone?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of genuine distress. "The others scattered after Cheyenne. Michael stayed because he's family, my cousin. The men outside are what's left of our crew. We've been expecting this day might come." Margaret moved to the window, looking out at the ranch that could have been her home. The life that could have been hers, built on a foundation of deceit, yet solid in its own way. "Take me with you," she said quietly, the words surprising her even as they left her mouth. Thomas stared at her as if she'd started speaking in tongues. "What?" Margaret turned to face him, conviction growing with each heartbeat. "Take me with you. What awaits me back east? Poverty, scandal, possibly debtor's prison for my father's unpaid loans. I came west for a new beginning. I still want one." "You don't know what you're asking," he protested. "Life on the run is no life for a woman like you." "A woman like me," Margaret echoed, a lifetime of being underestimated sharpening her tone. "You know nothing about what I can endure, Mr. Collins. My father gambled away our home and reputation before drinking himself to death. I kept us afloat for years through sheer determination. I am not some delicate flower who will wilt at the first sign of hardship." Thomas studied her with new eyes, reassessing. "Why would you choose this? Choose me, knowing what I am?" "I'm not choosing you," Margaret clarified. "I'm choosing survival. And I suspect having a woman along might actually help you avoid detection. Pinkerton agents will be looking for a gang of men, not a married couple." A reluctant admiration flickered across his face. "You've thought this through in the space of an evening." "I'm a quick study." Margaret stepped closer. "You needed a wife for appearances. I needed security and a fresh start. Our arrangement can still work, just with adjusted parameters." Thomas's laugh held no humor. "Adjusted parameters? You make running from the law sound like a business transaction." "Isn't it? You have skills and resources. I have intelligence and adaptability. Together, we have better odds than separately." Outside, a horse whinnied impatiently. Time was slipping away for decisions. "If you're coming, there are things you need to understand," Thomas said finally, his voice low and serious. "First, there's no turning back. Second, you'll have to trust me absolutely when it comes to staying safe. And third—" He hesitated, something vulnerable breaking through his carefully constructed facade. "I meant what I said about being a good husband. That doesn't change, regardless of my name or past." Margaret nodded, a strange calm settling over her, despite the madness of the moment. "I understand, and I have conditions of my own. No more lies between us. I won't be kept in the dark about plans or dangers. And if we establish a new life somewhere, it will be an honest one." "Honest," he repeated, testing the word as if it were a foreign language. "I haven't lived honestly in a very long time." "Then it's time to remember how," Margaret said simply. Their gazes held for a long moment, outlaw and schoolteacher, both desperate in their own ways, both willing to gamble on an uncertain future together, rather than face certain failure alone. "Pack only what you can carry on horseback," Thomas instructed finally, decision made. "We leave in 20 minutes. As Margaret rushed back to her room to gather her most essential belongings, a strange exhilaration mingled with her fear. Yesterday, she had been Margaret Wilson, mail-order bride, with modest expectations for a quiet life on a Montana ranch. Tonight, she was becoming someone else entirely. A woman willing to ride into darkness alongside a wanted man, chasing a freedom whose shape she could barely imagine. By the time she descended the stairs with her small satchel, Thomas had transformed as well. Gone was the careful rancher, replaced by a man of confident action, issuing crisp instructions to Michael and the others about rendezvous points and backup plans. He turned when she appeared, his expression softening momentarily. Last chance to reconsider, Margaret. She squared her shoulders, clutching her mother's Bible along with her few necessities. I've made my decision. Thomas nodded once, accepting her choice with the gravity it deserved. He handed her a dark wool coat, his own, she realized, as it enveloped her in warmth that carried his scent. "Stay close to me," he said, as they stepped into the moonlit yard where the men waited with horses. "From now on, we're Thomas and Margaret Collins, newlyweds heading west to visit family in Oregon." "Just married yesterday," Michael added, handing Margaret the reins to a sturdy chestnut mare. "In case anyone asks." As Thomas helped her mount, his hands steady at her waist, Margaret realized they were indeed being married in their own way, not with rings and promises before a minister, but with a shared secret and mutual dependence that bound them more irrevocably than any ceremony. They rode out under a canopy of stars, leaving behind the life that might have been for one neither of them could predict. The Sullivan Ranch disappeared into darkness as they crested the first ridge, Montana's vast wilderness opening before them like an unwritten page. Margaret urged her horse alongside Thomas's, finding her seat with a confidence that surprised her. He glanced over, moonlight illuminating his features, no longer Thomas Sullivan, respectable rancher, nor Thomas Collins, notorious outlaw, but something in between. A man in transition, just as she was a woman becoming something new. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly, their companions riding ahead to scout the trail. Margaret considered the question honestly. "Yes," she admitted, "but not of this journey. I'm afraid of the life I nearly settled for, one built entirely on lies. And now? Now we build something true," she said, her voice carrying in the still night air. "Whatever happens, whatever we become, it will be our choice, made with open eyes." As they rode west toward an uncertain future, Margaret felt strangely unburdened. The respectable schoolteacher was falling away with each hoofbeat, revealing a woman of unexpected courage and pragmatism. She had not expected her new life to begin this way, on horseback in the dead of night, fleeing the law with a band of former outlaws. But perhaps this wild beginning suited her better than the safe, predictable existence she had sought. Beside her, Thomas rode with the easy confidence of a man who had spent years evading capture. Yet when he looked at her, Margaret glimpsed something new in his expression, not just concern or responsibility, but wonder, as if she were the most surprising thing that had happened in his complicated life. Dawn was breaking on the horizon when they reached the border of Wyoming territory, painting the sky in shades of promise. The first step of many in a journey neither of them could have anticipated, but one they had chosen to face together. A schoolteacher and an outlaw, rewriting their story with each mile that separated them from the lives they left behind. The first rays of daylight revealed the true scope of the wilderness surrounding them. Margaret's muscles ached from hours in the saddle, a discomfort she hid beneath a mask of determination. She'd made her choice, chosen this outlaw and this life, and pride wouldn't allow her to show weakness now. Thomas led their small party, along narrow trails that didn't appear on any map she'd studied before coming west. They traveled in silence, broken only by the occasional murmured consultation between Thomas and Michael about direction or the condition of the horses. Around midday, they reached a secluded clearing beside a rushing creek. "We'll rest here," Thomas announced, sliding from his horse with fluid grace. "The horses need water, and we need to plan our next move." Margaret dismounted awkwardly, legs trembling from unaccustomed exertion. She stumbled slightly, and Thomas was instantly at her side, a steadying hand at her elbow. "You've done well," he said quietly, for her ears alone. Most seasoned riders would complain after a night like that. "I'm not most people," Margaret replied, straightening despite the protest of her muscles. The unexpected warmth in his eyes made her look away, unsettled by the complexity of their arrangement. The men worked efficiently, setting up a temporary camp while staying alert to their surroundings. Margaret learned their names as they moved about their tasks. James, the eldest, with silver-streaked hair and a tightly trimmed beard. Peter, whose wiry frame belied surprising strength. And Daniel, barely 20, with watchful eyes that rarely settled. "Former members of the Collins gang," Michael explained when he caught her observing them. "Loyal to Tom when others scattered." His tone suggested this loyalty was unusual and valuable. "And you're his cousin," Margaret said, recalling Thomas's words from the night before. Michael nodded, offering her a tin cup of coffee. "Grew up together in Kansas, always been more like brothers." He studied her openly. Never expected him to actually bring a bride into all this. Tom's usually 10 steps ahead, planning for every possibility. "I wasn't in his plans," Margaret acknowledged, "at least not this way. Makes me wonder what he sees in you that's worth the risk." The comment wasn't unkind, merely thoughtful, as if Michael was trying to solve a puzzle. Margaret sipped the bitter coffee, considering her response. "Perhaps the same thing I see in him, a chance at something different from what fate seemed to have in store." Before Michael could respond, Thomas approached with a worn map, which he spread across a flat rock. The men gathered around, their postures shifting from weary travelers to focused strategists. "Pinkerton agents will expect us to head for Canada," Thomas said, tracing a route northward, "or possibly west to the coast. They'll have telegraphed descriptions to every major town in both directions." "What about the southern route?" James suggested. "Through Idaho territory into Nevada?" Thomas shook his head. "Too many mining towns, too many people looking to earn reward money." Margaret stepped closer to the map, studying the terrain. "What about here?" She indicated a remote area west of their position. "You mentioned a friend with a hunting cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains in one of your letters." The men turned to her with expressions ranging from surprise to suspicion. "I have an excellent memory," she explained, meeting Thomas's gaze steadily. "You wrote that it was the most peaceful place you'd ever known, accessible only by a trail few people remember." A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. "Nathan Mackenzie's place. I haven't seen him in 2 years, but he owes me a favor." He studied the map again. "It's remote enough to give us time to think at least." "Nathan's not exactly fond of company," Michael reminded him, "especially company that might bring trouble." "He's less fond of the Pinkertons," Thomas countered. "Lost his brother to them during the railroad strikes back in '77. The decision made, they packed up quickly. Margaret noticed how Thomas assigned tasks that kept the younger man, Daniel, closest to her. Protection, she realized, or perhaps supervision. Trust would clearly need to be earned in both directions. As they prepared to move out, hoofbeats in the distance froze them in place. Thomas signaled for silence, drawing his revolver as Michael moved swiftly to extinguish their small fire. "Could be ordinary travelers," Peter whispered. Thomas shook his head. "Not on this trail." He turned to Margaret, his expression grave. "Stay with Daniel. If anything happens, he'll get you to safety." The young man nodded, moving to stand beside her with quiet efficiency. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as Thomas, Michael, and the others melted into the surrounding. Trees, weapons ready. The approaching riders, 3 men in trail-worn clothes, appeared around the bend. From her concealed position behind a stand of pines, Margaret could see the moment they discovered the remnants of the camp. They dismounted cautiously, one man kneeling to feel the still warm ashes of their fire. "Fresh," he said. "They can't be far." Another rider, tall and lean with a distinctive red beard, surveyed the area with practiced eyes. Spread out. Check. For tracks heading west. Collins always preferred high ground. Pinkerton agents. They had pursued them faster than expected, likely pushing their horses through the night. Margaret glanced at Daniel, whose finger rested lightly on the trigger of his revolver. His youthful face had hardened into something older, more dangerous. The sound of a snapping twig drew the agent's attention toward their position. The red-bearded man turned, hand moving to his holster, only to freeze as Thomas's voice cut through the clearing. "I wouldn't," he said calmly, stepping into view, with his revolver aimed steadily. "Hands where I can see them, gentlemen." The three agents exchanged glances, calculating odds as Michael and James emerged from different positions, creating a triangle of aimed weapons. "Thomas Collins," Redbeard said, carefully raising his hands, "you've led us quite a chase." "Seems to be ending poorly for you, Bryant," Thomas replied, recognition evident in his tone. "Tell your men to disarm." Slowly. The Pinkerton agent, Bryant, nodded to his companions, who reluctantly removed their gun belts. "You know this won't end here," Bryant said as Michael collected their weapons. "The agency won't stop. The Wyoming First National doesn't want—" "It's $37,000 back. They want your head on a platter." "Not a prospect I find appealing," Thomas answered dryly. "Sit down, all of you, against that tree." As the agents were secured with their own handcuffs, Margaret emerged from hiding, Daniel close behind her. Bryant's eyes widened at the sight of her. "Well now," he said, a new calculation entering his expression. "The famous Thomas Collins with a woman. That's a complication I didn't anticipate." His gaze sharpened. "Miss, if you're being held against your will—" "I'm not," Margaret interrupted, lifting her chin. "I'm his wife." Thomas glanced at her, surprise flickering across his features before he masked it. The half-truth they'd planned as their cover story now spoken with conviction that made it sound genuine. Bryant studied them both. Skepticism evident, a recent development, I'd wager. "Tell me, Mrs. Collins, did you know you were marrying a thief with a price on his head, or was that information withheld during courtship?" "My husband's past is known to me," Margaret replied evenly, "as is the fact that no one was harmed during those incidents." "Incidents?" Bryant laughed harshly. "Lady, your husband stole enough money to buy half of Montana territory. That's not an incident. It's a criminal enterprise." "Enough," Thomas cut in. "James, check their saddlebags. I want to know if they're alone or if we should expect more company." James returned shortly with several folded papers. "Maps with routes marked. And this." He handed Thomas a telegram. Thomas scanned it, his expression darkening. "They've got men at every major crossing into Canada and along the Oregon Trail." He passed the telegram to Michael. "And they know about the ranch." Margaret moved closer, reading over Michael's shoulder. The message confirmed that additional Pinkerton agents had arrived at the Sullivan Ranch, now clearly identified as belonging to wanted outlaw Thomas Collins. "Your legitimate life is burned," Bryant said, watching Thomas closely. "Cattle operation, land claims, bank accounts, it's all being seized as we speak. Whatever you rebuilt over the past 3 years is gone." Margaret saw something flicker in Thomas's eyes, grief, perhaps, for the honest life he'd almost had. Whatever future he had envisioned for them at the ranch was now impossible. "What do we do with them?" Peter asked, nodding toward the captive agents. "We can't let them go," James said pragmatically. "They'll be back on our trail by nightfall." "And we can't take them with us," Michael added. Margaret realized with a chill what they were considering. "You can't kill them," she said quietly but firmly. "That's not who you are." Thomas met her gaze, something unreadable passing between them. "No," he agreed finally. "It's not." He turned to Daniel. "Ride to the ridge. Signal if you see anyone else approaching." To the others, he said, "We'll take their horses and gear, leave them enough supplies to make it back to town, but it'll be a long walk." The agents would be delayed by days, not hours, but they would survive. Margaret felt an unexpected surge of relief, not just at the decision to spare lives, but at what it revealed about the man she'd chosen to follow. Thomas Collins might be a thief, but he drew the line at bloodshed. While the men prepared for departure, Thomas pulled Margaret aside, his voice low and urgent. "Bryant knowing about you changes things. They'll be looking for a couple now." "Isn't that what we planned?" she countered. "The newlywed cover story?" "That was before they had your description." His eyes searched her face. "This is your last chance, Margaret. I can leave you at the next settlement with enough money to start over. The Pinkertons have no quarrel with you. Not yet." Margaret straightened, indignation flaring. "You think I would abandon our arrangement at the first sign of difficulty? I told you last night, I'm not some wilting flower." "This isn't about your strength," Thomas said, frustration edging his tone. "It's about giving you a choice. Once we continue together, the law won't distinguish between us. You'll be considered an accomplice." "I made my choice," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. "Perhaps the better question is whether you still want me with you, now that I'm no longer useful as a cover for respectability." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, followed by a reluctant admiration. "You're more useful than you." "No," he said finally, "and far braver than I expected." Within the hour they were moving again, this time with greater urgency. The Pinkerton agents had been left securely bound, with enough slack to eventually free themselves, their weapons disabled and hidden separately. They traveled through increasingly rugged terrain, the mountains rising before them like sentinels. Margaret's body protested the punishing pace, but she kept her discomfort to herself, focusing instead on the rhythm of her horse's movement beneath her. By late afternoon, storm clouds gathered overhead, the air growing heavy with imminent rain. Thomas led them toward a rocky outcropping that offered some shelter just as the first drops began to fall. "We'll wait it out here," he decided, helping Margaret dismount. "Weather's a blessing, we'll wash away our tracks." Huddled beneath the meager shelter of overhanging rock, Margaret found herself pressed close to Thomas as the rain intensified, turning the world beyond their refuge into a grey curtain. His nearness was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder of the strange intimacy their situation had created between people who were, in many ways, still strangers. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, his voice almost lost beneath the drumming rain. "For what?" Margaret asked, turning to find his face inches from her own. "For all of this. You came west expecting a proper home, a respectable husband. Instead, you're running from Pinkerton agents with a price on your head." Margaret considered his words, weighing them against the life she had left behind. "I came west expecting security," she corrected, "and a fresh start. The form is different than I anticipated, but the substance remains." She hesitated, then added, "I would rather face uncertainty with eyes open than comfort built on lies." Thomas studied her with that same wondering expression she had glimpsed the night before, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Most women would be weeping with regret by now. "As we've established," Margaret replied with the faintest smile, "I'm not most women." The rain continued for hours, forcing them to make camp beneath the outcropping. As darkness fell, Margaret found herself watching Thomas as he conferred with Michael, their heads bent close over the map. The outlaw and his accomplice, planning their next move with the efficiency of men long accustomed to staying ahead of pursuit. Yet there was something else visible now, a protectiveness toward her and a careful consideration in their decisions that spoke of responsibility rather than mere self-preservation. These men were criminals, yes, but not the cold-blooded villains portrayed in dime novels and newspaper accounts. The realization was both reassuring and troubling. It would be easier in some ways if Thomas Collins were simply a villain. Instead, he was revealing himself to be a complex man with principles that didn't align with the law, but seemed to maintain their own internal consistency. As Margaret settled onto her bedroll, exhaustion finally claiming her, she wondered what else she would discover about the outlaw she had agreed to follow, and what he might discover about the schoolteacher who had chosen to ride at his side rather than preserve her respectability. The answers, she suspected, would reshape them both in ways neither could predict. Dawn broke over the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the peaks in soft gold and rose. Margaret woke to the sound of hushed voices, Thomas and Michael conferring, near the remains of their small fire. 5 days of hard travel had brought them deep into wilderness that seemed untouched by civilization, each mile putting distance between them and pursuit. The journey had transformed Margaret in ways both visible and hidden. Her hands, once soft from years of classroom instruction, now bore calluses from hours of riding. Her skin had bronzed under the relentless sun, and muscles previously untested had strengthened from necessity. More profound were the changes beneath the surface, a growing confidence in her ability to adapt, to endure conditions her Philadelphia acquaintances would consider impossible. She rose quietly, arranging her rumpled traveling clothes as best she could. Privacy was a luxury their situation rarely afforded, something she'd adjusted to with pragmatic acceptance. The men had been unfailingly respectful, creating what space they could for her when circumstances allowed. "We should reach Mackenzie's cabin by nightfall," Thomas said as she approached, offering her a tin cup of coffee. His eyes tracked her, movements with increasing familiarity, noting her straightened posture and determined expression. "How are you holding up?" "Well enough," Margaret replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. The morning chill penetrated her layers, making the warm cup a welcome comfort. "Though I confess, I long for a proper bath and clean clothes." A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. "Mackenzie's place has a stream nearby, cold as ice, but clean, and he'll have supplies we can use." Michael rolled up the map they'd been consulting. "If he doesn't shoot us on sight, man's gotten more paranoid over the years." "He'll remember his debts," Thomas said with quiet confidence. He turned to Margaret. "Nathan Mackenzie was a Union sharpshooter during the war, came west afterward, couldn't readjust to civilization, lives completely off the land, trapping and hunting." "And he's trustworthy?" Margaret asked, the question becoming routine whenever new names entered their planning. "With some things," Michael answered cryptically. "He hates the government, banks, and especially Pinkerton agents more than he dislikes company." They broke camp efficiently, a routine now well established among them. Margaret had found her place in their system, taking on tasks that freed the men for security and navigation. As she secured her belongings to her saddle, Daniel approached, offering a small package wrapped in oilcloth. "Found some blackberries?" "While scouting this morning," the young man said, his usual reticence softened by a shy smile. "Thought you might like something fresh." Margaret accepted the unexpected gift, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Daniel. That's very thoughtful." In the days since their flight from the ranch, she'd observed the dynamics among the men, their loyalty to Thomas, the fraternal bond between him and Michael, the respectful distance maintained by James and Peter. Daniel was the outlier, his youth and watchful nature setting him apart. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, yet his attention to details affecting their comfort and safety was constant. "You've been kind to include me in your plans," she added, truly curious about the young man who had accepted her presence without the suspicion the others had initially shown. "Most would consider a woman a liability in these circumstances." Daniel shrugged, adjusting his hat. Mr. Collins values loyalty above all else. You chose to stand with him when you could have gone another way. His expression suggested this simple fact was explanation enough. Besides, you handle yourself better than most men would. The compliment, delivered without flattery, warmed Margaret unexpectedly. She had spent years being underestimated, as a woman, as an unmarried teacher, as her father's dutiful daughter. To be judged on her actions rather than preconceptions was refreshingly novel. Their path that day led through increasingly dense forest, climbing steadily toward higher elevations. Thomas set a careful pace, mindful of the horses and the need to preserve their strength. They encountered no other travelers, the remoteness of the terrain providing a security that allowed brief moments of relaxation. During one such rest, while the horses drank from a clear mountain stream, Margaret found herself alone with Thomas for the first time in days. He was examining his mount's right foreleg, concern evident in his focused attention. "Is something wrong?" she asked, approaching cautiously. The horses were still somewhat foreign to her, magnificent creatures whose power and intelligence commanded respect. "Stone bruise," Thomas replied, running practiced hands over the animal's hoof. "She'll manage, but we'll need to go easier on the rocky sections." He glanced up at Margaret. "How's your mare treating you?" "Better than I deserve, given my inexperience," Margaret admitted. "She's patient with my mistakes." Thomas straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "You're a natural. Most city folk struggle much longer with riding." "Perhaps I was meant for this life," Margaret said lightly, though the words carried an unexpected weight once spoken. Thomas studied her, that familiar, wondering expression returning to his features. "What was your life before, Margaret? Really, not just the schoolteacher part." The direct question startled her, though she'd sensed it coming for days. This moment, when pretense would need to give way to genuine understanding if they were to continue together. "My father was a professor of literature at a small college," she began, finding the words came more easily than expected. "Brilliant, well-respected, and utterly incapable of managing practical matters. My mother died when I was 12, and I essentially ran our household afterward." She paused, old pain surfacing. What no one knew was that he gambled. Cards, horses, anything that promised quick returns. He lost everything piece by piece. First his inheritance, then our home, finally. His position when he borrowed from the college endowment fund. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression revealing neither judgment nor pity. He drank himself to death after that, leaving me with his debts and a reputation that closed most respectable doors. Margaret's gaze drifted to the mountains rising around them. Teaching was the only profession open to me, and even that was tenuous. When creditors became too persistent, a mail-order arrangement seemed the only escape from debtor's prison. "So you chose a stranger in Montana over prison in Philadelphia," Thomas summarized, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. "I chose possibility over certain ruin," Margaret corrected, "just as I did when I discovered who you really were." She met his gaze directly. "Your turn, Mr. Collins. What drove a man to become a bank robber, and then a rancher seeking a mail order?" "Bride." For a moment, she thought he might evade the question, retreat behind the careful barriers he maintained. Instead, he settled on a boulder, gesturing for her to join him. "I was a telegrapher during the war," he began, the admission clearly unaccustomed. "Union Army, stationed mainly behind the lines. After Appomattox, I came west like thousands of other restless young men, worked for the railroad a while, then as a bank clerk in Denver." A sardonic smile touched his lips. "That's where I learned how easily money moves, and how vulnerable it is during transit." Margaret sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of him in the cool mountain air, yet maintaining a proper distance. "How does one move from understanding vulnerability to exploiting it?" "Gradually," Thomas answered honestly. First job was almost accidental. The bank manager was skimming. I discovered it while reconciling accounts. Instead of reporting him, I approached him privately, suggested the money would be safer with me than with the bank examiners. He shrugged. He paid, disappeared east. I realized how simple it had been. And the Collins gang grew from there? Thomas nodded. Michael joined first. We developed a system, careful planning, disguises, timing transfers when security was lightest. No violence, no threats. In and out before anyone realized what had happened. Until Cheyenne, Margaret prompted. A shadow crossed his face. Cheyenne was different. A teller recognized Michael despite his disguise. Nearly became a hostage situation, but we managed to get out. That's when I knew we needed to stop. The stakes were getting too high. He looked at her directly. Contrary to what Agent Bryant claimed, no one was harmed, but it came closer than I ever wanted. So you came to Montana to become Thomas Sullivan, respectable rancher. Use the money to build something legitimate, he confirmed. Something that could sustain itself without constant risk. 3 years of honest work, or mostly honest. The irony is, I was good at ranching. Turned a profit every year. Margaret absorbed this, fitting these new pieces into her understanding of the complex man beside her. And the mail-order bride, was that part of the respectability you were building? A hint of color touched Thomas's tanned face. Partially, he admitted. A married rancher draws less scrutiny than a bachelor with unclear origins. But also... He hesitated, seeming to struggle with the words. Loneliness is its own kind of prison. Even surrounded by loyal men, I found myself wanting something more ordinary, a partnership of a different kind. The simple confession touched Margaret unexpectedly. This facet of Thomas Collins, the man who had sought connection through conventional, means despite his unconventional life, humanized him in ways his other revelations hadn't. And now we're both fugitives, she observed, the irony not lost on her. Running from the very respectability you sought to build. Not how I planned. Our wedding journey, Thomas acknowledged, a hint of genuine regret in his tone. Few journeys follow their intended paths, Margaret replied. On impulse, she reached out, briefly touching his hand where it rested on the boulder between them. We adapt to the path before us, not the one we imagined. The contact, though momentary, seemed to startle them both. In the days of their journey, physical proximity had been unavoidable, yet deliberate touch had remained rare. This gesture, freely offered and accepted, shifted something subtle between them. Thomas's response was interrupted by Michael's return from scouting ahead. "Trail's clear to the ridge," he reported, either not noticing or choosing to ignore the moment he had disrupted. "But we should move soon if we want to reach Mackenzie's before dark." They resumed their journey, climbing steadily through pine forests toward higher elevations. The air grew cooler and thinner, making conversation difficult and unnecessary. Margaret found herself reflecting on Thomas's revelations, seeing new dimensions in the man who rode ahead of her. The telegrapher turned bank clerk, turned outlaw, turned rancher. A man whose life had followed unexpected turns, not unlike her own. By late afternoon, they reached a lookout point that revealed the vastness of the wilderness they had entered. Mountains stretched in every direction, valley floors carpeted. In dense forest, the occasional silver ribbon of a stream catching the slanting sunlight. No sign of human habitation disturbed the primal landscape. "There," Thomas said, pointing toward a narrow valley nestled between two ridges. "Mackenzie's cabin is just beyond that stand of aspens." They descended carefully, the horses picking their way along a barely visible trail that wound through boulder fields and stands of lodgepole pine. The shadows lengthened as the sun dipped toward the western peaks, lending urgency to their pace. The cabin appeared suddenly, so well integrated with its surroundings that Margaret nearly missed it, built of rough-hewn logs darkened by years of weathering. It nestled against a rocky outcropping that sheltered it from northern winds. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, the only indication that the place was inhabited. Thomas halted their party at the edge of the small clearing, dismounting with deliberate caution. "Stay here," he instructed, handing his reins to Michael. "Mackenzie's first welcome is rarely friendly." Margaret watched anxiously as Thomas approached the cabin alone, calling out when he reached a certain distance. "Nathan, it's Thomas Collins. I've come to claim that favor you owe." For a long moment nothing happened. Then the cabin door opened a crack, the unmistakable barrel of a rifle appearing in the gap. "Collins!" a gruff voice called. "Thought you were playing rancher these days." "Or change of circumstances," Thomas replied calmly, though Margaret could see the tension in his posture. "Pinkerton agents discovered my new identity. We need shelter just for a few days." "We?" The door opened wider, revealing a lean figure, with a wild grey beard and piercing eyes that scanned their party with evident suspicion. "Brought your whole damn gang, did you?" "Just trusted friends," Thomas assured him. "And my wife." The words still sent an odd flutter through Margaret, despite the knowledge that their marriage existed only as a convenient fiction. From Mackenzie's expression, the revelation was entirely unexpected. "Wife?" he echoed incredulously. "The famous Thomas Collins took a wife. Must be quite a woman." Thomas glanced back at Margaret, something unreadable in his expression. "She is." After a tense negotiation conducted at a distance, Mackenzie finally lowered his rifle and gestured them forward. 2 days, he stipulated gruffly. "Then you move on, and your men sleep in the lean-to, not my cabin." As they led the horses into the clearing, Margaret assessed their reluctant host. Nathan Mackenzie appeared to be in his 60s, his weather-beaten face deeply lined beneath an unkempt beard. His clothing was mostly handmade from animal hides, giving him the appearance of a man from an earlier century. Yet his eyes were sharp and assessing, missing nothing as the party dismounted and began unloading essential supplies. "Ma'am," he acknowledged Margaret with a curt nod when Thomas introduced them. His gaze was evaluating but not unkind. "Can't offer much in the way of womanly comforts, but the roof doesn't leak and the fire's warm." "After a week in the wilderness, Mr. Mackenzie, those sound like luxuries indeed," Margaret replied with genuine appreciation. "And please, call me Margaret." Something in her straightforward manner seemed to ease his suspicion slightly. "You can fetch water from the stream around back," he told her, pointing with his rifle barrel. "Soap's inside if you've a mind to wash." The prospect of even rudimentary cleanliness was so appealing that Margaret immediately collected the offered bucket and located the stream, a clear, rushing brook that curled around the cabin's rear approach. The water was indeed icy, as Thomas had warned, but gloriously clean. She filled the bucket and then, with a furtive glance to ensure privacy, quickly washed her face and hands, gasping at the cold but reveling in the sensation of dust and grime being swept away. When she returned to the cabin, the men had organized themselves efficiently. Daniel and Peter were tending the horses. Michael and James were setting up sleeping arrangements in the crude lean-to, while Thomas and Mackenzie conferred by the fire inside. "Not likely they'll track you this far," Mackenzie was saying as Margaret entered, "but they're persistent bastards. Had a run-in with them myself back in '68. "We shook them in the valley," Thomas replied, "but we need a longer-term plan than just hiding in the mountains. Winter comes early at this elevation." Mackenzie glanced at Margaret, then back to Thomas. "There's talk of a passage to British Columbia. Guide who knows the old fur trapper routes can get people across without using main trails. Costs, though." "Money's not the issue," Thomas assured him. "Trustworthiness is. The old mountain man grunted. "Man's name is Blackwood, half Nez Perce, half Scottish. Doesn't care about American law or reward money. Cares about gold and keeping the old ways alive." He stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Could get word to him if you decide that's your play." Margaret set the water bucket near the fire and joined them, aware of how their conversation paused briefly at her approach. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said directly, "I appreciate your hospitality, especially given the risk to yourself. Please know, I don't expect any special accommodations." Mackenzie studied her with unexpected intensity. "Collins tells me you're a schoolteacher, Eastern educated." "From Philadelphia," Margaret confirmed, "though that life seems increasingly distant." "Huh." The single syllable conveyed volumes of evaluation. "Don't seem the type to throw in with outlaws. Must be quite a story there." "One best saved for after supper," Thomas interjected smoothly. "Speaking of which, we brought provisions to contribute to the meal." The evening passed in a curious domesticity, given their circumstances. Mackenzie's cabin was spare but surprisingly comfortable, with handcrafted furniture and shelves lined with books that revealed unexpected intellectual depths in the hermit. Margaret discovered he had been a professor of geology before the war, his retreat to the wilderness motivated by disillusionment rather than inability to function in society. "Found more honesty in these mountains than in any university hall," he told her as they prepared a simple stew from their combined supplies. "Rocks don't lie, weather doesn't cheat, animals don't betray, simple truths." "Yet you maintain your library," Margaret observed, noting titles ranging from classical philosophy to modern scientific treatises. "You haven't abandoned knowledge." Mackenzie's eyes twinkled with sudden warmth. "Knowledge and civilization aren't the same thing, Mrs. Collins. One enlightens, the other often constrains." The use of her supposed married name still startled Margaret, though she was growing accustomed to the role they were playing. Thomas, seated nearby, cleaning his revolver with methodical precision, glanced up at Mackenzie's words, his expression thoughtful. "You always did prefer philosophy to practicalities, Nathan," he commented. "Meanwhile, we need to discuss real options for moving north." The conversation shifted to routes and possibilities, the practical challenges of crossing terrain that grew more inhospitable by the day as autumn advanced toward winter. Margaret listened carefully, her practical mind assessing each suggestion, while the men debated merits and risks. "The guide, Blackwood," she said during a lull. "How would we contact him?" Mackenzie turned to her with new interest. "There's a trading post 2 days' ride from here. Man there knows how to get messages to him." "And how long until winter makes passage impossible?" she pressed. "First heavy snow could come any time from late September," Mackenzie admitted. "Once it starts in earnest, the high passes are closed until spring." Margaret calculated swiftly. "Then we have perhaps 3 weeks at most to make arrangements and complete the journey." She looked at Thomas directly. "We should send word to this Blackwood immediately, while we rest the horses and prepare supplies." Thomas studied her with that now familiar expression of surprised appreciation. "You're right," he acknowledged. "Michael could ride to the trading post tomorrow, make inquiries without drawing attention." The practicality of her suggestion seemed to elevate her status further in Mackenzie's estimation. The old man nodded approvingly. "Your wife has a good head on her shoulders, Collins. Might keep you alive yet." Later, as the men settled into the lean-to for the night, Mackenzie surprised Margaret by offering her his own bed while he took a pallet near the fire. "Been sleeping on the ground for 20 years, he said gruffly when she protested. "One more night won't harm me." Thomas, the only other person remaining in the cabin, watched this exchange with veiled amusement. The pretense that they were a married couple had created an awkward arrangement, with Thomas designated to sleep on the floor near the door, a compromise between propriety and practicality that satisfied no one completely, but preserved necessary appearances. When Mackenzie finally drifted to sleep, his soft snores the only sound beyond the crackling fire, Margaret found herself oddly awake, despite the exhaustion of their journey. She sat wrapped in a blanket near the hearth, watching the flames dance. While her thoughts traveled similar unpredictable paths, Thomas joined her silently, offering a tin cup of Mackenzie's surprisingly decent whiskey. "You should rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges." "My mind refuses to—" "Quiet," Margaret admitted, accepting the cup and taking a small sip that burned pleasantly down her throat. "Too many possibilities to consider." "You've impressed Mackenzie," Thomas observed. "Not an easy feat." Margaret smiled faintly. "I believe he expected a fragile flower who would wilt under pressure. People often underestimate what women endure." "As a matter of course." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, firelight playing across his features. In these quiet moments, his guard lowered. She could see glimpses of the man beneath the outlaw's necessary defenses, intelligent, reflective, capable of gentleness, despite the hardness his life had required. "I've been thinking about what happens if we reach Canada safely," he said after a comfortable silence, "about what kind of life we might build there." The emphasis on "we" was subtle but unmistakable. Their arrangement, initially one of mutual convenience and temporary necessity, was evolving into something neither had fully articulated. "What kind of life would you want?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious about his vision of a future beyond running. Thomas contemplated the fire, the whiskey in his cup untouched. "Something honest," he said finally. "Ironic, coming from me, I know. But I found I liked the legitimacy of ranching, building something sustainable, watching it grow through honest effort." "You could do that again," Margaret suggested. "Different name, different place, but the same principles." "We could," he corrected gently, his eyes meeting hers across the small space between them, "if that's what you want." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. They had married under false pretenses, fled together under pressure, and now faced an uncertain future that would require commitment beyond their original arrangement. "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that I would like to teach again someday, perhaps in a small community where formalities matter less than substance." She paused, measuring her next words. "Beyond that, I find myself surprisingly open to possibilities I never would have considered in Philadelphia." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding the deliberate ambiguity of her response. "We have time to decide," he said, though both knew this wasn't entirely true. Decisions would be required sooner rather than later, paths chosen that would determine their future course. The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney toward the star-filled sky beyond. In that moment of shared quiet, Margaret realized how far she had traveled from the desperate woman who had boarded a stagecoach bound for Montana Territory just weeks ago. The journey had stripped away pretenses and expectations, revealing core truths about herself and about the complex man who watched her with increasingly undisguised admiration across the flickering firelight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as Thomas had said. But tonight, in this remote cabin perched on the edge of wilderness, Margaret Wilson, or Collins as circumstances required, felt an unexpected peace settle over her. Whatever came next, she would face it with clearer understanding of both herself and the unlikely partner fate had provided. Michael returned from the trading post as dusk settled over the mountains, his expression grim. Thomas met him at the edge of the clearing, tension evident in his posture as they conferred in low voices. Margaret watched from the cabin doorway, her heart sinking as Thomas's shoulders stiffened. "What is it?" she asked when they approached, unable to bear the suspense. Pinkerton agents, Michael reported, removing his hat to wipe his brow. 4 of them at the trading post, showing sketches of Tom and asking questions. They're offering double the reward for information. $10,000 now. Thomas's face remained impassive, though Margaret had learned to read the subtle signs of his concern, the tightening around his eyes, the slight clench of his jaw. "Did you find Blackwood's contact?" Michael nodded. "Left a message, as Mackenzie instructed, but the agents have been there for 2 days. They're searching every settlement and outpost within 100 miles. Mackenzie emerged from behind the cabin, arms laden with firewood. "Determined bastards," he commented, having overheard. "Question is, how did they narrow their search to this area?" Thomas and Michael exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "Bryant," Thomas said finally, "the agent we left, tied up. He's cleverer than I gave him credit for." Margaret moved closer, wrapping her shawl tightly against the evening chill. "What do you mean?" "He must have recognized something when we discussed the cabin," Thomas explained. "Some reference I made that helped him identify the general area once he got free. The mention of the Bitterroot Mountains was probably enough," Mackenzie suggested, arranging the wood near the door. "Not many places a man can disappear in this territory." Darkness gathered around them as they retreated inside the cabin, the mood somber as they considered their increasingly limited options. The horses needed at least another day of rest before attempting the difficult journey ahead, yet every hour they remained increased the risk of discovery. "We could split up," James proposed when they gathered for a council that evening. "Create multiple trails, confuse the pursuit." Peter nodded in agreement. "Michael and I could head east, draw them away while you and Mrs. Collins make for the Canadian border." Thomas considered this, his expression troubled. "It puts you at considerable risk." "No more than we've all been in before," Michael countered, "and it increases your chances." Margaret listened to their strategizing, struck by the loyalty these men demonstrated. They had followed Thomas across hundreds of miles of wilderness, and now offered to place themselves in greater danger to ensure his escape. Such devotion spoke volumes about the man she had impulsively chosen to follow. "There's another option," she said, drawing their attention, "one that doesn't require separation." The men turned to her with varying degrees of surprise and interest. Even after days of proving her resilience and resourcefulness, they sometimes forgot she was more than just a responsibility to be protected. "Blackwood is our best chance for crossing safely into Canada," she continued. "But we need time for him to receive the message and respond. What if, instead of running or splitting up, we hide in plain sight?" Thomas studied her with that familiar intensity. "What are you suggesting?" "The Pinkerton agents are looking for Thomas Collins and his gang," Margaret explained, the plan crystallizing as she spoke. "But they wouldn't look twice at a married couple traveling with relatives, a family group moving north before winter." Mackenzie stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Disguise, you mean? Change appearances, manner, the whole presentation." "Precisely," Margaret confirmed. "I could cut and color Thomas's hair. Different clothes would alter his silhouette. If we present ourselves as a family of homesteaders seeking land in the Northern Territories, we might move through checkpoints without raising suspicion." The men exchanged considering glances, evaluating the merits of her suggestion. "It could work," Michael admitted. "Pinkertons are looking for outlaws on the run, not settlers heading north." "I have dyes made from walnut husks and indigo," Mackenzie offered unexpectedly. "Used them myself years back when evading some disagreeable parties." Thomas hadn't spoken, his gaze fixed on Margaret with an unreadable expression. "You continue to surprise me, Mrs. Collins," he said finally, the use of her assumed name carrying a new weight in the context of her proposal. "It's a good plan. risky but potentially more effective than running blindly. If we're to be a believable family, Daniel contributed quietly, we should practice. Details matter. How we speak to each other, who we claim to be. Margaret nodded, warming to the young man's practical insight. We'll need a story. Where we're from, where we're going, why we're traveling as winter approaches. Minnesota, James suggested. Far enough away that details wouldn't be easily verified, close enough that our accents wouldn't seem suspicious. A failed farming venture, Peter added, driving north for a fresh start on cheaper land. As they developed the fabrication, Margaret found herself taking notes, organizing their fictional history with the same attention to detail she had once devoted to lesson plans. Thomas watched her work, occasionally contributing suggestions, but mostly observing how naturally she assumed this role of creator and coordinator. The transformation began at first light. Mackenzie produced his promised dyes along with scissors, a straight razor, and a surprisingly varied collection of clothing, acquired over years of solitary trading. People pay in what they have, he explained with a shrug when Margaret expressed surprise at the assortment. I don't much care for fashion, but I never turn down useful goods. Margaret started with Thomas, whose distinctive dark hair and clean-shaven face were perhaps his most recognizable features. With steady hands, she trimmed his hair shorter on the sides, leaving enough length on top to change the shape of his face when combed differently. The walnut dye gradually transformed the deep brown to a nondescript, muddy color. Neither fully brown nor gray. Grow out your beard, she instructed as she worked. Even a few days' worth will change your appearance significantly. Thomas submitted to her ministrations with surprising patience, sitting still as she moved around him. Only his eyes betrayed any reaction, as her fingers occasionally brushed against his skin, lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked quietly, as she rinsed the excess dye from his hair. Margaret concentrated on her task, avoiding the intensity of his gaze. "My father often couldn't afford a proper barber. I learned out of necessity, like many things." When she finished, the transformation was remarkable. With his hair darkened and styled differently, the beginnings of a beard shadowing his jaw, and clothing borrowed from Mackenzie's eclectic collection, Thomas Collins had effectively disappeared. In his place stood a weather-beaten farmer, unremarkable in every way that might draw attention. "Your turn," Thomas said when she stepped back to assess her work. "Your hair is too distinctive as well." Margaret hesitated, one hand rising unconsciously to touch her chestnut locks. Her hair had always been her one vanity, thick, wavy, reaching nearly to her waist when unpinned. The thought of altering it created an unexpected pang of resistance. Thomas recognized her reluctance immediately. "We could just pin it differently," he offered. "Perhaps under a different hat." "No," Margaret decided, straightening her shoulders. "If we're committed to this plan, we should be thorough." She reached for the scissors herself, then paused and extended them to Thomas. "Would you do it? I can't see properly to do it myself." A charged silence filled the small cabin as Thomas accepted the scissors, their fingers brushing momentarily. Mackenzie made a show of needing something from outside, leaving them alone with this unexpectedly intimate task. "Are you certain?" Thomas asked, standing behind her as she sat on the room's only chair. Margaret nodded, gathering her courage. "How short should it be?" "Not too short," he replied, his voice dropping slightly. "Just enough to change its appearance beneath a bonnet." His fingers moved gently through her hair, assessing its length and weight. "I'll be careful." The snip of scissors and the sensation of weight falling away from her head created a strange mixture of loss and liberation. Margaret closed her eyes, focusing on the careful movements of Thomas's hands as he worked, occasionally murmuring quietly for her to tilt her head or hold still. "Your trust honors me," he said softly as he trimmed, the words meant for her alone. "I know what this sacrifice costs you." "It's only hair," Margaret replied, though they both recognized the symbolism of the moment. Another tie to her former life severed, another step into the uncertain future they faced together. When he finished, her hair fell just below her shoulders, the ends neatly trimmed. The walnut dye darkened it to a deep mahogany, altering its natural highlights. With Mackenzie's help, they found a serviceable dress in a muted brown that completed her transformation into a farmer's practical wife. The others underwent similar changes, each assuming the role they would play in their fictional family. Michael became Thomas's brother, James and Peter cousins, traveling together for mutual protection. Daniel, already youthful in appearance, easily adopted the persona of Margaret and Thomas's teenage son, a fiction that created an odd tension whenever mentioned, as if the very suggestion of such intimacy between them crossed boundaries neither was prepared to acknowledge. By midday, the metamorphosis was complete. Gathered in Mackenzie's clearing, they resembled nothing so much as a travel-weary pioneer family, their clothes plain but serviceable, their manner deliberate rather than furtive. "If I didn't know better, I'd pass you on the trail without a second glance," Mackenzie declared, surveying their work with grudging approval. "Though you'll need to remember to act the part, not just look it." Margaret understood his concern. Appearances could be altered, but habits of speech and movement were harder to disguise. Thomas still carried himself with the alert confidence of a man accustomed to command, while Daniel's careful watchfulness betrayed training beyond that of a simple farmer's son. "We'll practice," she assured Mackenzie, already mentally composing the behaviors they would need to adopt. "The journey north will give us time to perfect our roles." That evening, a visitor arrived unexpectedly at the cabin, a tall, broad-shouldered man with copper skin and watchful eyes, who materialized from the forest with such silence that even the horses didn't register his approach until he stood in the clearing. Mackenzie greeted him without surprise. "Blackwood, didn't expect you so soon." The newcomer nodded once in acknowledgement, his sharp gaze assessing each member of their party before settling on Thomas. "You seek passage north," he stated rather than asked, his voice carrying the faint cadence of his native heritage beneath precise English. "We do," Thomas confirmed, stepping forward. "Mackenzie speaks highly of your knowledge of the backcountry routes." Blackwood's expression remained impassive. "It will cost you $500 in gold per person, half now, half upon crossing the border." It was a fortune by frontier standards, yet Thomas didn't even blink at the demand. "Agreed, provided we leave within 2 days. Pinkerton agents are converging on this area." The guide studied Thomas with unnervingly direct scrutiny. "I know who you are, Collins. Your reputation travels far." Vim. His gaze shifted to Margaret, assessing her with equal intensity. "This is your woman?" "My wife," Thomas corrected firmly, moving slightly closer to Margaret in an unconsciously protective gesture. Blackwood seemed to find something meaningful in this response. "The journey will be difficult. 3 days through country no white man travels willingly. Your disguises may fool Pinkerton agents, but the mountains care nothing for human deceptions. They will test your true nature." His words carried a weight beyond their literal meaning, as if he assessed not just their physical capacity for the journey, but something deeper, their worthiness to receive his guidance. "We understand the risks," Margaret said, meeting his gaze directly, "and we're prepared to face them together." Something flickered in Blackwood's expression, respect perhaps, or simple acknowledgement of her resolve. "Be ready at dawn the day after tomorrow," he instructed. "Bring only what you can carry if your horses fail. The mountains are already growing cold." With that warning delivered, he melted back into the forest as silently as he had appeared, leaving them to contemplate the reality of what lay ahead. "Cheerful fellow," Michael commented dryly, breaking the tension. "Sounds like a delightful journey he's planning." "Blackwood doesn't exaggerate," Mackenzie warned. "If he says it's difficult terrain, prepare for something just short of impossible. But he knows paths the Pinkertons will never find, and he's never failed to deliver those under his protection." That night, unable to sleep despite the day's exertions, Margaret slipped outside to stand beneath the star-filled sky. The mountain air carried a knife edge of cold that hinted at the winter to come, yet the clarity it brought was worth the discomfort. Here, surrounded by ancient peaks and forests that had witnessed centuries of human struggle, her own troubles seemed simultaneously significant and infinitesimal. "You should be resting," Thomas's voice came quietly from behind her. "Dawn comes early in the mountains." Margaret didn't turn, sensing him move to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the chill night. "My thoughts are too busy for sleep." "Second thoughts?" he asked, the question carrying layers of meaning beyond its simple words. "No," Margaret replied with a certainty that surprised even her. "But I am thinking about what awaits us. What kind of life we might build if we reach Canada safely." Thomas was silent for a long moment, his gaze following hers to the stars. "I've been thinking about that as well, about what we truly want beyond mere survival." The deliberate correction warmed her more than any fire could have. In the days since their flight from the ranch, something had shifted between them, the practical arrangement evolving into a partnership neither had anticipated. "And what conclusions have you reached?" Margaret asked softly. Thomas turned to face her, his expression visible in the moonlight that gilded the clearing. With his altered appearance, hair differently styled and darkened, the shadow of a beard changing the contours of his face, he seemed both familiar and strange, the outlaw and the farmer coexisting in one complex man. "That I want more than an arrangement of convenience," he said directly, his voice low and intent. "That somewhere between Silver Creek and this mountain, you've become essential rather than expedient." The confession, delivered without flourish yet weighted with sincerity, caught Margaret's breath in her throat. They had danced around this truth for days, acknowledging it obliquely through glances and small gestures, yet neither had given it voice until now. "I feel the same," she admitted, the words both frightening and freeing, "though I never expected to find such connection in circumstances like these." Thomas smiled faintly, the expression transforming his features in the silvered light. "Life rarely delivers what we expect, for better or worse. Often both simultaneously," Margaret observed, returning his smile. The moment stretched between them, possibility hanging in the cold mountain air. Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and brushed a strand of her shortened hair from her face. The touch, gentle and careful, conveyed more than any passionate gesture could have, respect, tenderness, and an unwillingness to presume despite his confession. Margaret leaned slightly into his touch, her own hand rising to cover his where it lingered near her cheek. This small acceptance seemed to release something long held in tension between them. Thomas drew her carefully into his arms, a tentative embrace that asked rather than demanded, offering comfort and connection without expectation. They stood together beneath the vast Montana sky, two fugitives finding an unexpected harbor in each other's arms. Their future remained uncertain, filled with dangers neither could fully anticipate, yet in this moment of quiet acknowledgement, Margaret felt a certainty that had eluded her since leaving Philadelphia. Whatever came next, whether Canada offered sanctuary or further challenges awaited, They would face it not as a mail-order bride and her outlaw husband, but as partners who had chosen each other with clear understanding of both strengths and flaws. Dawn would bring preparations for the final leg of their journey, negotiations with Blackwood, and the constant vigilance necessary for survival. But this night, this moment, belonged to the recognition of a bond formed in the crucible of crisis, unexpected, unplanned, yet increasingly essential to them both. The mountain pass loomed before them, a narrow corridor between towering peaks, draped in early snow. 3 days into their journey with Blackwood, the terrain had grown increasingly challenging, steep slopes, icy streams, and paths so faint they seemed to exist only in their guide's memory. Margaret adjusted her woolen scarf against the biting wind, her gaze fixed on Thomas's back as he led their reduced party single file along a precarious ledge. They had left Mackenzie's cabin at dawn 2 days earlier, their disguises complete, their fictional family history rehearsed to seamless consistency. James and Peter had separated from them that morning, taking an eastern route as additional insurance, against pursuit. Canadian border lies just beyond that ridge, Blackwood announced during a brief rest, pointing toward a distant line where the mountains gave way to gentler forest. We cross by nightfall, if weather holds. Thomas nodded, his expression revealing both relief and caution. They had encountered no Pinkerton agents since leaving the cabin, but experience had taught him that safety could be illusory, danger appearing when least expected. "Any settlements on the other side?" he asked, studying the terrain ahead with a practiced eye. "Trading post 20 miles north," Blackwood replied. "Small place. Man there asks few questions if you have money to spend." Margaret watched this exchange from her perch on a boulder, appreciating how Thomas balanced hope with practical vigilance. The journey had tested her in ways Philadelphia life never could. Physical endurance pushed to limits, comfort sacrificed. For survival, identity itself transformed through necessity, yet she had discovered reserves of strength previously untapped, earning respect not through social position, but through resilience and quick thinking. Their guide signaled it was time to move on. As they remounted their tired horses, Thomas maneuvered his mount alongside Margaret's. "Almost there," he said quietly, reaching over to adjust her saddle blanket with a casual intimacy that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," Margaret replied honestly. "Though I confess, I'll welcome a proper bath and bed when opportunity allows." A smile touched his bearded face, softening the weathered lines. "I've been thinking about what comes next, after we cross." "And what have you decided?" she asked, curious about the plans forming behind those thoughtful eyes. "That perhaps we should make our arrangement official," Thomas said, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private from the others. "If you're willing, a real marriage, not just a convenient fiction." The proposal, delivered without ceremony on a wind-swept mountain pass, struck Margaret as perfectly fitting. Their relationship had never followed conventional patterns. Why should this moment be any different? "I believe I am willing," she replied, matching his directness with her own, "though I would appreciate knowing what name I'll be taking, as Thomas Collins seems likely to attract unwanted attention." His laugh, rare and genuine, warmed her despite the mountain chill. "I was thinking of Thomas Wilson. Your father's name has no connection to my past, and it would honor your family." The suggestion touched her unexpectedly. "Thomas Wilson," she repeated, testing the sound. "It has a respectable ring to it." "Respectable is what I aim to be," he said, suddenly serious. "Whatever life we build in Canada, I intend it to be honest. No more running, no more false identities." Margaret studied him, seeing the sincerity in his expression. The outlaw was choosing to lay down his arms, to surrender that part of himself, in favor of the man he had glimpsed possibilities of becoming during his years as a rancher. Their moment was interrupted by Michael calling from ahead, urgency in his tone. Thomas immediately urged his horse forward, Margaret close behind. They found Michael and Blackwood at a bend in the trail, stopped in tense silence. Below them, perhaps half a mile distant, dust rose from a group of riders moving steadily along the valley floor. At least 6 men following the most accessible route toward the border. Pinkerton agents, Blackwood stated with quiet certainty, moving to block the main crossing. Thomas studied the distant figures, calculating distances and timing. How did they get ahead of us? Telegraph lines, Michael suggested grimly. Word travels faster than horses when the right connections are made. Margaret joined them, assessing the situation with growing alarm. Is there another way across? Blackwood's expression remained impassive, though something like respect flickered in his eyes at her practical response. There is always another way for those willing to take greater risk. He pointed toward a seemingly impassable section of the ridge, where steep rock faces intersected with a narrow defile barely visible from their position. Old hunting trail, difficult for horses, dangerous in places, but it emerges 3 miles west of where they wait. Thomas exchanged glances with Michael, silent communication passing between men who had faced danger together for years. "We'll take it," Thomas decided. Better a hard trail than certain capture. The difficult path proved to be a harrowing test of nerve and endurance. They were forced to dismount and lead the horses through sections where the trail narrowed to mere feet, with sheer drops on one side and towering rock on the other. Twice they needed to unload the animals entirely and pass supplies hand to hand across particularly treacherous segments. Margaret moved with careful determination, focusing on each step rather than the dizzying vistas that opened occasionally through gaps in the rock. The shortened hair and practical clothing that had begun as disguise now served essential purpose, allowing her to navigate without encumbrance where fashionable dress would have proven dangerous or impossible. Near the trail's highest point, disaster nearly struck. Daniel's horse balked at crossing a narrow stone bridge formed by a fallen boulder, its fear threatening to send both animal and handler over the edge. Margaret watched in horror as the young man struggled to control the panicking creature, his own footing precarious on the icy rock. Thomas reacted instantly, handing his reins to Michael and moving with deliberate calm toward the frightened horse. His voice dropped to a soothing murmur as he approached, hands steady as he took control of the animal's head. "Easy now," he said, maintaining eye contact with the rolling-eyed mare. "We'll go together, nice and slow." With patient persistence, he guided both horse and Daniel across the dangerous passage, one careful step at a time. When they reached safety, the young man's face showed naked relief and gratitude. "Thank you," Daniel said simply, the words carrying the weight of more than this single rescue. Thomas clasped his shoulder briefly. "We leave no one behind. Remember that if nothing else about me." They continued onward, the incident cementing something Margaret had observed developing throughout their journey, a sense of true family, forming among this disparate group, not the fictional family they presented to the world, but something forged through shared danger and mutual dependence that transcended blood relation. As afternoon light began to fade, Blackwood led them to a sheltered hollow just below the ridgeline. "We rest here until dark," he instructed. "Border crossing is safest under night sky." Thomas positioned himself beside Margaret as they huddled against the growing cold, sharing the warmth of a blanket and the last of Mackenzie's strong coffee. "When we cross," he said quietly, his breath forming clouds in the mountain air, "we'll be starting with almost nothing. The money I managed to bring will establish us initially, but beyond that—" He hesitated, uncharacteristic uncertainty in his expression. Margaret completed his thought. "Beyond that, we build something new, together." She leaned slightly against his shoulder, drawing both warmth and reassurance from the contact. I didn't leave Philadelphia seeking luxury, Thomas. I sought security and purpose. I believe we can create both, given time. The simple confidence in her voice seemed to settle something in him. He nodded once, decision made or confirmed. There's a settlement in British Columbia, near enough to civilization, for comfort but distant enough for privacy. Blackwood says land there is available for those willing to work it. Farming again? Margaret asked, remembering his mention of enjoying the ranching life. Perhaps, or something else entirely. His hand found hers beneath the blanket, fingers intertwining with gentle pressure. The point is having choices rather than necessities driving our decisions. As darkness settled fully over the mountains, Blackwood signaled it was time to move. They mounted weary horses for the final push, following their guide along the ridgeline toward what he promised was a manageable descent into Canadian territory. The crossing itself was anticlimactic. No dramatic pursuit, no last-minute confrontation with authorities, simply a careful navigation down a steep trail that eventually opened onto gentler slopes covered in pine forest. Nothing marked the invisible line they crossed, yet Margaret felt the significance of the moment like a physical weight lifting. "We're across," Thomas confirmed when they reached a small clearing around midnight. The relief in his voice was evident but controlled, the caution of years on the run not immediately discarded. "Blackwood says we'll reach the trading post by mid-morning." They made cold camp, unwilling to risk a fire so close to the border. Margaret found herself too wired for sleep, despite exhaustion that reached bone deep. Instead, she sat wrapped in blankets, watching Thomas confer with Blackwood about their final payment and the route ahead. Daniel settled nearby, his young face thoughtful in the moonlight. "Will you really stay together?" he asked suddenly, the question startling in its directness. "After all this is over?" Margaret considered the young man who had spent days pretending to be her son, recognizing the genuine concern beneath his query. "Yes," she answered with quiet certainty, "though I suspect over is the wrong concept. This journey may be ending, but another is just beginning." "He's different with you," Daniel observed, "steadier, more like the man he started becoming at the ranch." He hesitated, then added, "I've ridden with Mr. Collins for 3 years. Never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Before Margaret could respond to this unexpected confidence, Thomas returned, his business with Blackwood concluded. The guide would leave them at dawn, his responsibility discharged once they were safely into Canadian territory. "You should rest," Thomas told Margaret, settling beside her with the casual familiarity that had developed between them. "Tomorrow we begin building our new life." "As Thomas and Margaret Wilson," she affirmed, testing the names together for the first time. "Settlers from Minnesota seeking opportunity in British Columbia." "Not entirely a fiction anymore," he observed, his arms slipping around her shoulders beneath the blankets. The gesture was protective yet respectful, offering comfort without presumption. Morning brought clearer skies and the promise of easier travel ahead. Blackwood departed after a brief farewell, the second half of his payment secured in a leather pouch at his belt. Margaret watched him disappear into the forest, this enigmatic figure who had guided them to safety, never to be seen again. "Ready?" Thomas asked, offering a hand as she mounted her horse for the journey to the trading post. Margaret nodded, straightening in the saddle with renewed purpose. The hardships of their flight had changed her visibly. Skin weathered by mountain sun and wind, hands toughened by practical work, posture reflecting a confidence born of survival rather than social training. No longer the desperate schoolteacher seeking security through mail-order arrangement, she had become a woman who had chosen her path with clear eyes and determined heart. The trading post appeared by mid-morning, a collection of log buildings nestled in a small valley. Smoke rose from chimneys, the site of permanent habitation, both welcoming and slightly jarring after days in wilderness. They approached cautiously, their practiced family persona in place. Thomas and Margaret Wilson, traveling with his brother. Michael and their son Daniel, seeking a fresh start after crop failures in Minnesota. Ordinary settlers with an ordinary story, remarkable only in their determination to begin again. The trading post's proprietor, a burly man with a Quebec accent and shrewd eyes, asked few questions beyond those concerning their immediate needs and ability to pay. Yes, there was land available further north. Yes, the settlement welcomed new families with useful skills. No, American authorities rarely cross the border in pursuit of anyone less notorious than murderers. As they replenished supplies and arranged for proper accommodations, their first night under solid roof since Mackenzie's cabin, Margaret found herself watching Thomas interact with the locals. He moved differently now, the wariness of a hunted man gradually giving way to the straightforward manner of Thomas Wilson, settler and family man. The transformation wasn't just in appearance, but in essence, as if crossing the border had allowed him to step fully into the identity he had been rehearsing. That evening, in the privacy of a small but clean room above the trading post's general store, Margaret finally indulged in the luxury of a proper wash. The proprietor's wife had heated water and provided soap that smelled of lavender, rather than the harsh lye they'd used on the trail. Such simple comforts seemed extravagant after their journey. Thomas knocked softly before entering, respecting boundaries despite their imminent plans. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. The proprietor's wife had this, he explained, offering the parcel. Thought you might appreciate it. Margaret unwrapped the package to find a simple but elegant comb carved from pale wood, decorated with a pattern of leaves and flowers. A completely impractical item, serving no survival purpose, yet the gesture touched her deeply precisely because of that impracticality. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the delicate carving. "I realized you lost yours during our escape," Thomas said, watching her with gentle intensity, left behind with everything else at the ranch. The thoughtfulness behind the gift, that he had noticed such a small detail amid their dramatic flight, revealed more about the man she had chosen than grand declarations ever could. "Tomorrow we'll see about land," he continued, settling into the room's single chair while she took the edge of the bed. "Start making plans for something permanent." "And a proper wedding?" Margaret suggested, her fingers still tracing the comb's pattern. Thomas nodded, a smile warming his features. "As soon as possible, though I find I already think of you as my wife in all the ways that matter." The simple admission reflected how profoundly their relationship had evolved from its pragmatic beginnings. What had started as mutual convenience had transformed through shared danger and growing respect into something neither could have anticipated. "I feel the same," Margaret acknowledged. "The ceremony will merely confirm what we've already decided." Outside their window, the Canadian wilderness stretched in all directions, vast and promising. The future held uncertainties, establishing a home, building legitimate livelihoods, perhaps someday explaining their unusual beginnings to children they might have. Yet Margaret faced these prospects without the fear that had driven her westward. Merely weeks ago, she had left Philadelphia seeking security through a mail-order marriage to a stranger, a desperate measure born of desperate circumstances. Instead, she had found herself on an unexpected journey alongside a complex man with his own path to redemption. Together, they had crossed more than geographical borders, traversing the boundaries between strangers and partners, convenience and commitment, past identities and future possibilities. As Margaret Wilson, formerly Margaret Spencer of Philadelphia, prepared for her first peaceful night's sleep in Canadian territory, she reflected on the strange alchemy that had transformed potential disaster into unexpected blessing. The road ahead would not be easy, but it would be theirs to travel together, no longer running from the past, but moving purposefully toward a future they would build with their own hands. Thomas Wilson, formerly Thomas Collins of the infamous Collins gang, watched his soon-to-be wife in the lamplight, his expression holding a contentment that had eluded him during years of both outlawry and respectable ranching. He had advertised for a practical woman of good character, seeking the appearance of normal life. Instead, he had found a partner of unexpected courage and resilience, whose presence had helped him discover the man he truly wanted to become. They were, in the end, both mail-order bride and notorious outlaw transformed through circumstance and choice, their unlikely beginning merely the first chapter in a story continuing to unfold with each day of their shared journey. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.